President Faust, obviously the external environment remains very uncertain. The economy, federal funding for research, but you have an institution to lead and plans to make. How far along are the schools and the senatorial administration in adapting to the reality that has unfortunately come about with the decline in the endowment?
We got a good head start last year because we made some estimates pretty early in the year about dramatic downturns in the endowment, and so we began to address the implications of that as early as late November or December. And that enabled us to make some significant savings in last year's budgets as we began to plan longer term opportunities and choices to get back to where we ultimately want to be, which is in, as you well know, about a 5 to 5.25% payout rate on the endowment. So I think what happened last year is the reality sank in, people began to see what kinds of cuts they could make in the short term, and then they began to set up mechanisms for longer term planning that would enable us to strategically address the lingering problems. So I'd say people have made good progress, but we still have a way to go.
And there must be other longer term things to do, new ways of operating systems. I know you're looking at libraries. How are those initiatives going? Not just truing up one's budgets, but trying to figure out new ways of operating together.
I think in an environment like a university, there is very distributed wisdom, and there's also distributed interests, and it's very important that we understand how the kinds of strategic changes we want to make will have an impact on our ability to do our work, on our ability to teach, and on the various constituencies involved. So we've done planning around this, and we've set up, as you know, in FAS task forces to look at the possibilities within the different academic fields and within the college. You'll find in other parts of the university similar kinds of planning mechanisms that are looking at the strategic opportunities. We're doing that in the central administration as well, and the library task force is an example of a initiative that's meant to define principles that will enable us to think differently about how we organize our libraries. That's just one example.
So do you think this is the early part of a multi-year adjustment? Obviously you don't know about the external circumstances, but are you in the middle of the process, or do you think the university is getting close to closure on the things that has to do with what you know now?
What we did last year as we looked at the change in our endowment, we decided that within no more than 5 years we wanted to be back at a payout rate that seemed to us responsible. So that meant the around 5 to 5.25. And then we thought, how fast do we want to get there? And we decided that we should front load our actions, that we should take more dramatic actions initially because we wouldn't be depleting our endowment resources while we got adjusted if we adjusted faster. And it would also encourage people to think big about the kinds of changes rather than to just keep slicing and slicing in what we thought would be a very demoralizing way. So we advised our schools that we would expect to distribute last year 8% less, as we have, from the endowment than the preceding year. And we told them to expect at least the same in the year that is going to come next. And then we anticipated smaller reductions in the following 3 years. Now, we will this fall revisit those requests and assumptions based on what we know now about the endowment and what we expect about endowment performance in the future. But we see those as having set parameters that seem to us very reasonable ones, and we'll say, all right, how does it look from here? Are there any little tweaks we need to make, or do we continue on exactly that same path? So we would expect, as we said, for the coming year, at least 8%, but that gives us at least means 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. Where we come in that will be a result of how we assess the scenarios for the economy in October, or which is probably when we'll begin to do this, 2009.
Each school obviously has a different kind of student body, different resources, different needs, different opportunities. Are there adjustments in common that most of the schools are making to adapt to their new circumstances?
For many schools across the university, problems are quite similar, and we spend about half our budget across the university on personnel costs. So that has been a significant factor for everybody. We've had to look at our workforce size how we manage it, how it's changed, and how we wish it to be shaped in the future. And as you know, we've taken a variety of steps in that regard. The first was to look very hard at replacing people at open positions or new positions, and to put a very high bar for hiring new people. The second thing we did was to freeze salaries across the university for non-exempt staff and faculty in order to control workforce costs. And then we introduced the voluntary early retirement program that offered to long-serving staff an opportunity to retire with a nice set of arrangements. And then, unfortunately, in last June, we turned to some layoffs. About 275 people were identified as in positions that would no longer exist. So these were hard decisions to make in the case of the layoffs, but we saw them as an imperative for addressing what was one of the major costs across the university. The schools worked together on these. We agreed together as deans and a council of deans about the holding positions and freezing salaries. We worked together on the voluntary early retirement and on the reduction in force. So that was a across the university kind of measure. I think as you look at how schools are responding, they're looking at very similar kinds of issues, and some of those administrative issues have been shared across the Council of Administrative Deans. Things like procurement, IT. There was a series of working groups on efficiency matters, it was called, and so those were shared across the university as well. But then there's separate conditions in different schools. I don't think any school but the business school has its own or had its own faculty club. One of the business school's cost-saving measures was to eliminate the business school faculty club. So there are idiosyncratic attributes of each school that provide opportunities for cost saving as well.
Is there anything changed at all about the renovation of the Fog Art Museum?
We are in a phase now where we're working on budgets for that. Renzo Piano was here last week working on the final design plans. We've been looking very hard at costs and figuring out ways to make sure we're as rigorous as possible in containing those costs. And so it's moving through the phases that it would be expected to at this point. Mm-hmm.
What measures have you been taking within the administration?
The central administration has cut its operating budget by 8% from last year to this, and we're looking hard at how we can make additional reductions in the year to come. With our new EVP arriving very soon, we know we have an ally in this endeavor because she has undertaken similar exercises in other institutions, so we hope that she will be able, we know that she will be able to assist us in identifying further cost savings within the central administration. We're also looking at how we can do our business more efficiently. For example, how can we coordinate and consolidate our HR activities across the central administration rather than replicating strengths. So in a way, it's a model of the university as a whole. We have some of the same issues within the central administration. Sure. We're also looking at some reorganizations that involve the central administration but also include the schools. How might we share some of our communications functions across the university by giving our communications function more work in some instances, more responsibility, more opportunity to collaborate and both help the schools and help ourselves by reducing overlaps or redundancies. We've also been undertaking a look at how we do our capital planning functions. We've had a capital planning function in the Alston Development Group as well as in our administrative units, the unit that was under Sally Zeckhauser's leadership, her vice presidency. And we've been looking at a model to consolidate that and to integrate it with school planning and development efforts, which we think will bring us savings both within the central administration and in relationship to the schools as well.
The university, like the world, went through a sort of whiplash, and in the university's case, I think there was a period of fast growth and physical and faculty expansion, and suddenly almost a halt to that, or a reorientation. How has that affected how the university does its investing in the endowment, how it does its own financial operations?
There was a report from HMC last week, the annual report of Harvard Management, that I believe did an excellent job of talking about the changed environment and the lessons learned from the past year. I had breakfast with Jane Mandillo this morning, and we were talking about some of the ways in which the thinking and planning of the university will henceforth be far more integrated with the thinking and planning of the management of its endowment. We were remarking to one another how the level of dependence of the university on income from the endowment shifted so dramatically over the last decade or so, up to 35% of our operating budget coming from the endowment each year, and how that has changed implications for how the endowment should be invested that no one quite took account of as each year our dependence on endowment kind of creeped up a little bit. No one said, stop. We're in a very different place. What does that mean about how we invest? And what it means is we need to avoid volatility. We need to be more active in attending to issues of liquidity. So those are important lessons that have been learned as we see what the nature of this relationship is. So it's not just that we have someone over there investing money. They're managing an endowment.
So
and
it's
I think we're more,
I mean, there was a happy circumstance where things largely went up,
yes,
and it perhaps became easy to count on that. I mean, it's a different circumstance now. Certainly, Jane Mandillo has had a lot of change in her first year.
She has. She has.
I noted that she reported on a different basis, that the endowment company report is in a different format from prior years. Are there other changes going on in financial reporting about the university's budgets or strategies that you envision? Or is that Jane doing her thing in her first traumatic year at the management company?
Well, we all discussed the Harvard Management Company report. It wasn't just Harvard Management that decided to do it this way. And it seems to me that in a sense that report is a expression of our recognition that, in a sense, it's about the university as a whole and its investments, not simply a management company talking about its activities. And so she contextualized it more. She, I think, situated it within a larger set of reflections and her plans for the future. She talked a lot about the organization of Harvard Management and how she thought it would serve the endowment and the university in the future. So it was broader gauge, which seems to me a value and a very good idea. We will release our financial reports for the university in a few weeks, and those we're working on now, and I think we also are very aware of a context in which big questions are being asked. It's not simply a financial matter. It's how does the organization of Harvard work as a whole?
How has the change in the world circumstances, the university circumstances, affected your own view of your leadership, what you're hearing people expect of you, what their perception is of your presidency at a fraught time?
People, I believe, look to me now for a more assertive leadership than they might have welcomed or asked for a year ago. There was a lot of appetite when I became president for consensus building, for dispersed authority and listening and generating widespread ideas. That is still extraordinarily important because it will be the foundation for how we move forward. But the need to define those directions in a rather forceful way is, I believe, more desired and more important, given the uncertainties of the economic future and the kinds of questions that have been raised in the past year.
One place that people are interested in about how it works is the corporation, of which you are a member as president. And I wondered about your thoughts in the current circumstances where people need to know from the corporation what the endowment distribution is going to be, what the corporation's role is in these circumstances, whether the corporation's role is, the way the corporation operates is fit for the 21st century, if there are new demands, if there's any discussion that has been brought about at the corporation level from the events of the last year or so.
Mm-hmm. The corporation's fundamental obligation is to make us think about both the present and the future. And they're meant to be a step back from those of us who are involved in Harvard every day and see the immediate needs around us. They have to attend to the immediate needs, but they also have to say, how does this play out for the long term? What that might seem appealing right now would not be so appealing if we looked at it in a 50 or 100-year context. And fundamentally, that is the business of endowment management in the most literal sense. How much do we leave in the endowment for the future? How much do we spend right now? So that, of course, is their decision. But I think that's a metaphor for their role more generally, which is to make sure that we don't simply think about our lives, but think about the lives of the generations to come. And so in this particular moment, I believe that has had important implications for them as they think, what are the lessons and how do we engage ourselves in ways that bring us through these difficult times and keep us focused on the big questions. So they're the big question askers.
And have the big questions changed any in the last year?
The big questions of how do we do the absolute best teaching and research, how do we bring in and support the most outstanding faculty and students, how do we use the resources, intellectual, financial, physical, of the university in the maximum way, how do we look beyond our little organizational bureaucracies and constraints to think big? Those are the questions that they continually pose and that I think are so important for us all to keep in our sights, especially at a time like this when the demands of the daily have been so insistent. You know, how do we fix the budget for today? The corporation wants to know how we fix the budget for today so that it has a good impact on tomorrow. So they have to be involved both in the details and in situating that within the larger framework.